Good afternoon, folks, and I'd like to welcome you to CIWEM's presidential induction for 2020. I'm David McHugh, the outgoing president of CIWEM, and it's my honor to open proceedings today. And I'd particularly like to welcome the CIWEM members that have dialed in today, and also welcome the panel of speakers that will be joining our incoming president, Niki Roach, for a fireside chat shortly. And we have an impressive panel of speakers today in terms of breadth of organizations and individuals, so you're in for a treat. Now, this is a significant day for CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Managers, and I'm excited to be passing the baton on to Niki and looking forward to hearing about her theme, Everything is Connected. In terms of the format today, we're taking a new approach for this induction. In addition to being an online event, it will also include a virtual fireside chat, an informal chat to be chaired by our incoming president. So this is very much a first for CIWEM. Now, I do have some formalities to deal with, which are specific to this new virtual format. So we're using Slido today to help you get the most from this session. And Slido is an online tool, just to increase engagement in virtual events like this. So it's going to allow you post comments and participate in polls. And we'd like to hear from you throughout the afternoon, and we'll be using Slido for that purpose. So I'm going to act as your digital guide and get you ready to use Slido for the afternoon. And you can think of this like the digital version of a safety announcement about where the fire exits are. So we're going to start now by going to slido.com, and there's a code. You'll be asked for a code. It's up on the screen there, hashtag C34. So once you put that in, you'll be at the CIWEM Slido page. And just to get you folks warmed up, we'd like to get a little sense of where you're from, where our audience is dialing in from today, and this is anonymous, this question. So you should see a poll section. So if you click on that and share with us where you're dialing in from, if you do that over the next few minutes, then Niki will share the results with us shortly. And we're going to be making use out of this Slido tool throughout the session. And it's going to enable you to share your ideas for CIWEM, as well as asking our panel questions. Now, I do hope it works for you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. There are some great speakers to listen to, and you can always email us your feedback afterwards. Okay, so I think we have Slido under control. And now I would like to share some reflections on my term as president. And one of the privileges that goes with the role is having the opportunity to select a theme for the year. And I appreciated the chance to speak about a topic that has always been very important for me. So my presidential theme focused on mobilizing CIWEM's members into action to tackle the climate and ecological emergency. And I'd like to share with you just a little story of how my thoughts crystallized into this theme. So it goes back to a spring afternoon last year here in my hometown of Cork, when I was going out for a family lunch. And I was walking through the city centre with my wife and our two younger kids when we came across some traffic chaos. And it turned out that Extinction Rebellion had the city in gridlock. So this is a collective of environmental activists, and they were engaged in a direct action, which is a form of civil disobedience. They were having a die-in, which entails lying down on the road at a main junction, and they'd made these chalk marks around themselves, like you see in the murder scenes on TV. And tempers were rising when I came across this. There was a motorist out arguing with the activists, and cars were turning around, going back to where they came, and getting stuck with the oncoming traffic. This was adding to the gridlock. So I took the opportunity to discuss with my kids the underlying concern of these activists, which is the climate and ecological emergency. And we stopped on the footpath, looking at the chaotic scene in front of us, while I shared my thoughts on how important the underlying issue was. And yet I remained on the footpath as a bystander. And I have to be honest, I felt a bit awkward because I understand the science and I know our trajectory, and I'm familiar with the inadequacy of our response to this crisis. And, you know, I wanted to join those activists, but I hesitated because I wasn't comfortable to engage on the issue in that way. I'm an environmental professional and I take action in my own way. So designing wind farms is my day job. And it was a dilemma for me. And then my daughter, Saoirse, who was 12 at the time, she came up with a great suggestion. And I don't know if she sensed my discomfort or understood my dilemma, but she suggested that we step down off the footpath and onto the road. So, I mean, we just moved a foot or two, but we were no longer bystanders. So we were neither bystanders nor die-in activists. And that step forward got us over the hurdle to action. And we found our space in between. We found a way for us to engage. And so that became my presidential theme, that we can all become change agents as we tackle the climate and ecological emergency. So as I engaged with CIWEM's members over the past year, there were two key messages that seemed to resonate with the members very well. Now, the first is the idea of net zero. So the most impactful approach to tackle the climate crisis is to decarbonize our economies. And a net zero target is precisely the mechanism to do that. So last year saw some significant developments in this regard, with legally binding targets of net zero carbon emissions to be achieved by the year 2050 being adopted by many countries and states. And so in May of last year, we saw the UK become the first country to officially declare a climate emergency, which is exactly the type of global leadership that we need in the 21st century. And this was followed by legislation committing the UK to a legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And since then, there have been dozens of countries making similar pledges and enshrining them in law. And then the second message relates to our role. And this is best summed up by the question, how can environmentalists provide leadership to the wider public on this issue? So, as CIWEM noted in its declaration of a climate and ecological emergency last year, we need to create climate champions of our members. And I believe that our focus needs to be on shaping the policy response. And the key objective has to be increasing the level of engagement of the public engagement on this crisis. So I mean, what that means is we need to get smart on influencing techniques. We need to figure out how to engage people's hearts. And we need to share inspiring stories about how the human race reverses this climate change. And this is a good news story, especially because the technical solutions are already identified and available to us to achieve this reversal. And I think it's really important that we share this insight. It's very effective in warding off the despair that can come from excessive thinking about our current trajectory. And there's some great resources available to us, like Project Drawdown. So this is a list of climate solutions that are available utilizing current technology that would limit warming to within the range of 1.5 to 2 degrees, which is the limit set in the Paris Accord. And CIWEM wants to facilitate us, its members, to become advocates in this regard. And I would push harder and say that environmental professionals have a duty to step up and provide leadership to the public in tackling the climate crisis. Now, it's been a great honor for me to have been the 33rd president of CIWEM, and I appreciated the opportunity to engage with our members. From Dublin to Belfast, I was welcomed at branch dinners, and from London up to Nottingham, I had the opportunity to speak at events and conferences, exchanging ideas and gaining new insights. And then as the COVID-19 virus impacted our lives, I turned to alternative means of communicating with our members through CIWEM's website and social media. I adapted as we've all done over the past year. And going forward, well, we're very lucky to have an inspiring environmental professional and business leader take up the role of CIWEM president. Niki and I served together on the trustee board for the past 4 or 5 years now, and I've always valued her contributions and opinions. They challenge, they add value, and they're delivered in a clear and grounded manner. And I know that Niki will find new ways to communicate with our members, as we've seen today with this exciting new format that Niki has designed. So I'm pleased to hand over the chain of office to Niki, at least figuratively, and induct her as the 34th president of CIWEM. So Niki, congratulations and all the very best for the year ahead.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the warm introduction. It's lovely to be heard, be thought of as grounded and mature. It's not words that a lot of people that know me use very often, so that's great. Thank you primarily for the excellent example you set over the last 12 months of your presidency. I have been inspired to hear you speak, as you just did, so eloquently about the climate and ecological emergency, and I hope to use my time over the coming year to continue to champion those messages. I also want to thank the CIWEM team, and in particular Sophie, Al and Jane, who've worked so hard to enable this afternoon in our slightly new format to work, and are continuing to work behind the scenes to ensure that the tech keeps working. So firstly, hello. A very, very warm welcome to you, our audience. Whether you're here live today or watching this in the future, it's lovely to see the familiar names of colleagues and friends alongside new friends that I look forward to getting to know over the next year. It is my absolute privilege to be the 34th president of CIWEM, and as I suspect a few of you might have been wondering, the third female to hold the role. As I'm sure you know, CIWEM is an international institution, and so I'm wondering where everyone is joining us from this afternoon. So David explained Slido, and if you joined us just after that, head to slido.com and then click C34 and join our poll. We're going to use Slido to make sure that this is not just us talking all afternoon. We'd love to hear from you. So if you head to slido.com, you shall see where everybody's dialing in from. So let's have a bit of a quick look. We look like we've got India to Innsbruck, somebody in their living room, excellent. And well, Leeds is me, actually. Great, lovely that we've got some international delegates and lots of people in the UK, which is wonderful. Wherever you are, I am utterly delighted that you've taken the time this afternoon to join us. And I'm really looking forward to sharing a fantastic 90 minutes or so with you and our brilliant panel. Beginning this role, I am feeling a heady combination of enthusiasm and excitement and a sense of responsibility. It's wonderful to be part of an institution that celebrates its 125th birthday this year and not only reflects on its heritage, but looks forward with optimism and determination. I've been reflecting on the circumstances that the global COVID-19 pandemic has created, and I imagine that the next 12 months will provide a balance of uncertainty and definitely opportunity. The significant difficulties experienced by some of our members and the communities our work serves is not to be underestimated. But the opportunities for innovating quickly, creating new ways of working, and finding consensus at almost unprecedented speeds also gives me a sense of hope for the future. And so, with that in mind, before I introduce our wonderful panel, I thought I might share with you a little background to my theme for the year. This year's presidential theme is Everything is Connected. It's certainly not a new idea. Da Vinci spoke of it in his Principles for the Development of a Complete Mind, but it's John Muir, the 19th century Scottish naturalist and father of the US national parks, who for me seems to encapsulate our current challenges perfectly. He said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. When I was about 10 years old, my mum and dad bought me a copy of the Blue Peter Green book. For those of you not old enough to remember the early 90s, and I appreciate that I've just dated myself, and for those of you who aren't in the UK and have literally no idea what I'm talking about, let me give you a quick summary. Blue Peter is a very long-running children's TV programme in the UK, and the Blue Peter Green Book was released to accompany the programme. Now, I can't find my copy. It'll be in the loft somewhere at my mum and dad's house, I suspect, with a lot of other rubbish they can't get rid of. But if I had it in front of me, on the back of the book, it would say the following. You care about our future. You want to know what's happening to the world. But how can you stop the many threats to our planet? Every day seems to bring more gloomy predictions about the environment. But you can act now to make our world a better place. That's the theme of the Blue Peter Green Book. From the television team who really know what children are thinking and caring about, here's a book that explains clearly and simply what the major environmental problems are and how you can help deal with them. Problems such as rainforests, stop the destruction, the greenhouse effect, how can we slow it down, our towns, make them cleaner places, our wildlife, how can we protect it, recycling, less waste, the key to our future. The world is in your hands. Save it. 1990. Skip forward a few years, and my parents drove me and my young brother out on a weekend trip to Wales. On one of these trips, we visited the Elan Valley. It was pretty memorable, as I think it was the first time I'd ever seen an impounding reservoir and started to understand what it was for. My dad explained, this is how Birmingham, where I lived, gets its water, all the way from Wales. I remember being amazed by what I was hearing. Another skip forward, and I'm in the middle of almost nowhere for a week in Wellies, in a tributary to the South Tyne, just off the Pennine Way in the north of England, doing my dissertation fieldwork for my geography degree at Sheffield. I'm looking at river hydraulics with a salt tracer, and my very good friend and now CIWEM fellow is assessing the chemical denudation rate of the catchment. We are also destroying her mum's Nissan Micra that she kindly lent us to drive all the way up there without realising there was a 45-minute drive up a dirt track to get to the site. Sorry, Judith's mum. A final leap forward in our story to the world of work. I'm working in the UK water sector and joining CIWEM. I'm managing incidents to avoid major loss of water supply to customers. I'm seeing the Falkirk Wheel be constructed on a CIWEM Young Members study tour to Scotland. I'm enabling with my team 150,000 dry tonnes of biosolids to be recycled. I'm supporting a water company to deliver challenging plans to reduce household water usage. I'm taking my young son to CIWEM trustee board meetings with me. Each of these moments had an impact, left a strong memory, and ultimately was all connected to the same system. My whole career has been knitted together by the systems that I've worked within and the circularity and the interconnectedness of those systems. In recent years, I've spent time thinking and talking about the circular economy and how we embrace its principles across our sector. Principles of designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use to reduce consumption, and regenerating rather than just sustaining natural systems. I truly believe everything is connected, and as CIWEM members, we have the collective capability to make a significant difference to our future. And that's why I chose Everything is Connected as my theme for this year. But the real link here is always the people. My time in that river and the dissertation I produced was stronger because of my friend and colleague working with me to refine my approach, especially when heavy rain destroyed half of my sample locations. The customers we kept supplied with water who were oblivious to the potential impact only continued to have that water because of the strong communications between field and customer service teams and our service partners. And the loss of a quarter of our sludge treatment capacity overnight was resolved because of the support network of contacts at neighbouring water companies who offered up their treatment capacity and supported us over many months. I didn't have to think twice about continuing to attend board meetings after having a baby because my CIWEM colleagues welcomed me and my son warmly when he started to crawl and it became trickier to have him in meetings. The CEO bought a playpen and we all embraced meetings with an extra member. Bringing us right to present day, I work with a team of exceptional colleagues and friends whose strong values and commitment to global resilience and prosperity inspire me every day. Relationships have been key to every part of my journey. The connections I've made, many of which are through CIWEM, have underpinned so many of these moments. And I truly believe that the uniqueness of CIWEM is its breadth and its ability to make these connections. CIWEM is your home. If you're an engineer or a chemist or a social scientist or even a geographer, our members thrive on solving big interdisciplinary challenges. They discuss flooding and resilience and biodiversity and water quality and the circular economy, and the list is long and comprehensive and full of the important stuff. We have a grounding in public health and a strong heritage, but we are always looking to the future. CIWEM's plan is to be digital first. This will help us embrace our membership internationally, enabling us all, I hope, to feel more connected than ever and learn from our collective experience. I hope this year to amplify the voices of our members doing exceptional work around the world. The presidential team and I will be looking for opportunities across the year to do just that through our blogs and our new podcast series. So please do get in touch if you'd like to share your experiences with our global community. We have an opportunity and probably an imperative to reflect the communities we serve. This is a challenge to many of the sectors our members represent. I really hope that my theme for the year enables us to continue to have more of those authentic conversations about how to ensure CIWEM is a truly diverse and inclusive community. Joining a professional institution is a significant decision. Becoming a chartered member, you're stating externally that you personally uphold the values of the institution, regardless of who you work for or what job you're doing. That really resonates with me, and we want to see our members see CIWEM as a safe place in which they can always be their full selves and which enables them to develop and perform at their best. And the challenge, well, we know we face a climate and ecological emergency. We knew that in 1990. And the pressures of population growth and infrastructure resilience and more extreme weather events now feels even more real than before. The challenge of bringing new approaches to tackle these systemic problems is here. I keep thinking, if not now, then when? And if not us, then who? So that brings me to today. Today, we have assembled a brilliant team of individuals from a spectrum of backgrounds to think about how we approach the very real challenge of applying system thinking to solving those really big problems. So before we begin our conversation, I'd like to ask you to use Slido across the course of the next hour or so to share with us your ideas and reflections on what actions we can take now as CIWEM members to meet the challenges of the climate and ecological emergency. And I'd also like to ask you to use Slido to ask any questions you'd like of our panellists. You'll see a Q&A tab on the menu bar at the top, and we'll have a Q&A towards the end of the discussion. So if you just joined us, it's slido.com and put in the code C for Charlie 34. And if you don't want to ask your own questions, you can rate other people's questions, and the ones with the most amount of votes make it to the top of the list. So you'll have worked out by now, I enjoy a good story and I enjoy a good chat. And so I've asked our wonderful speakers to think about what stories they might be able to share with you today. It's easy for me to say everything is connected, but what does that look like in practice? So here to help us explore that are Rachel Skinner. Rachel's the Executive Director of Transport at WSP. She's a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and she's also the Senior Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers and will become its first female president in November 2020. Rachel's also a patron of Women in Transport, a chartered engineer, chartered transport planner, and ICE Fellow and Trustee. It doesn't end there. In 2019, she was confirmed by the FT as one of the UK's top 100 women in engineering. But the most fantastic thing about Rachel's biography is that while she might be in transport these days, she's a geographer by background. I'd also like to introduce Richard Benwell. Richard has just joined us from a meeting with some MPs, so thanks for making it, Richard. Richard is Chief Exec of Wildlife and Countryside Link, and previously he's been Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State at DEFRA. He's worked on policy and advocacy at WWT and RSPB, and served as a clerk in the House of Commons Commission. So welcome, Richard. Damian Crilly. Damian has 20 years international experience in catchment management research, policy and practice. And his mission as National Manager of the Environment Agency's Strategic Catchment Partnership Teams is to progress development of a catchment-based approach. And his current focus is on the application of systems-based approaches. I was going to say last, not quite, Neil Dewis. So Neil joined Yorkshire Water in 2001. He's a fellow of CIWEM and the Director of Water Service Delivery at Yorkshire Water, where he has accountability for delivering water to the whole of the Yorkshire region. Neil's got a broad knowledge and experience of delivering water operations and has held positions in regulation, strategy and customer service alongside business transformation, where he was a director. Neil has a passion for sustainable landscape management and is a chartered water and environment manager with a background in environmental science and a member of the CIWEM Water Supply and Water Quality Panel. And he's also a director of the rural regeneration company, Pennine Prospects. And last but by no means least, Rob Lawson. So Rob is a director of Artesia and he's also the chair of the CIWEM Water Resources Panel. He's over 25 years experience in water resources management, including water company planning, environmental studies, water neutrality investigations and the assessment of water security. And at Artesia, Rob's work's been focused on improving methods for estimating and forecasting customer demand and analysing policy responses to deliver reductions in water use. And Rob's particularly interested in water use behaviour and the social science behind this. So now you know the panel, let's get started. So hopefully my panellists have got their cameras on and they're off mute. Can we see everybody? Okay. This is just Niki needs to work out her IT, not anybody else. Great stuff. Lovely to see you all, guys. So first of all, I want to hear about some of the tricky stuff associated with systems thinking in practicality. So the kind of scale and complexity of our current environmental challenges certainly personally can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes. We are hearing right now about a green recovery from COVID-19. We are very well aware of the climate and ecological breakdown. So I'm interested firstly in how you're addressing these global challenges in the roles that you are doing at the moment and kind of what lens you view them from. So anyone fancy going first or shall I just pick on somebody? Let me pick on someone. Damien, you're not on mute, so let's go with you first. Damien, fancy, give us your thoughts.
Hi, Niki, thank you, and hello, everyone. Well, literally today, I was involved in a multinational project launch called ICON. And it's through my association with Durham University that this transdisciplinary project has kicked off, and it's researching the theoretical underpinning of connectivity, developing a framework of methods, and then using that to make the application of connectivity science to manage complex systems. And the partners in this project range from intergalactic scientists, neurosurgeons, geographers, all sorts of various disciplines that are really trying to understand this very difficult and complex field of connectivity science and systems analysis. And it gave me great confidence this morning to be part of such a group of high-ranking academics from all across the globe addressing this very matter, because we are in a time that some are calling VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And we need to really step up and find a way to improve our resilience. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But it's all about catchments. I'll rest my case there, shall I?
Damien and I had a chat earlier on this week, didn't we? And we both waxed lyrical about catchments for some time, so we best make sure we rein him in a little bit. VUCA, that is, I've not heard VUCA. I like it. I'm writing that down. Cool. Thank you, Damien. That's well timed, isn't it? That's perfect. Did they know you were doing this afternoon? That's good. Rob, do you fancy sharing your thoughts with us next? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So, since we've also had a chat and I've been jotting some thoughts down, and the one thing that keeps coming back in terms of addressing these complex problems and making everything connected is collaboration. And it's one of those buzzwords that's thrown around quite easily, but it is really hard to do and really hard to get right. So I've been thinking back over projects that I've worked on over my career and things that have gone well and not so well, and successful examples. And weirdly, one of the ones that has gone really well and has been really interesting, that's kind of disappeared off the radar for various reasons, is water cycle studies, which were a thing back in the late noughties and early, about 10 years ago. And they were a kind of holistic view of water cycle issues in new developments. And that was a collaboration between water resource planners, hydrologists, flood analysts, flood modelers, and drainage engineers. And that was an example of something that worked really well. And the next thing I thought was, well, how did that happen? And that was driven through policy and regulation. And as David highlighted at the start, that's one of the key areas that needs to, I think, needs to influence how we collaborate to make sure we recognise how everything's connected. And in those water cycle studies, we did actually think about the connectivity between water supply, water efficiency, the good design of properties not to flood, and the good design of the development itself not to flood, and how drainage can be managed to deal with that. So through things like rainwater harvesting systems that included flood attenuation, for example. So that was just one quick thing that occurred to me as a particular thing. Collaboration, as Damian just highlighted, with that really, you know, massive multidisciplinary research project, but also what drives it, and is it being done for the right reasons with the right kind of scope and objectives in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, policy feels like it's an absolute linchpin to a lot of these kind of conversations, doesn't it? Yeah, thank you, Rob. Rachel, do you fancy going next? Great to hear from you.
Yeah, sure, Niki, thanks. I feel before I kick off, I should just do a little tiny correction, just to make sure that some Jean Venables, she was in fact the first woman ICE president about 10 years ago. So I will be the second, but the youngest, we think, of all of them so far, men and women, which is very exciting. Anyway, I think it's funny because I was kind of kicking around ideas before doing this event this afternoon in terms of some of the stories and so on, as you've just been saying. And it just strikes me that everything just unrolls back to this thinking around actually what is it we're trying to achieve? And the fact that if we aren't joined up and if we don't draw out these connections and we don't understand where they all are, actually our chances of getting to what we want to do are so much less. So I mean, you can apply that straight through into the pieces around climate change and carbon. You can certainly apply it through into the pieces around, you know, levelling up and balancing out inequalities, that kind of thing. And you can also apply it just as much to the COVID recovery process in the biggest possible sense. And it's not just all of us, it's everyone else as well, isn't it? But I think that all of us as a kind of a technical community, and here I should say I feel like a complete outsider, being not a CIWEM member, but I am a geographer, as we keep on saying, so that's okay. I feel like I'm sort of amongst friends.
But anyway, don't worry, it's still time.
That's all good. But no, I think, you know, as a sort of a broad technical community, if we can sort of figure out, right, you know, in the main, what we're trying to do across all these different projects, all these different programs and portfolios, is to achieve some of those big ticket items and just make things a little bit better, one tiny step at a time. The only way to do that is to understand where these connections actually lie. So one kind of brilliant thing that actually I should have done a bit more research about, clearly, is that in terms of my theme for the ICE presidential year, which kicks off in just about 6 weeks' time, is also going to be to do with climate change and net zero carbon, and we're going to try and get the civil engineers as a whole on the case now in terms of getting organised around that. And interestingly, also for exactly the same reasons as we were just hearing, to do with my kids. So I've got a 12, 10 and a 7-year-old, and in particular the two older ones, they just don't get it why we're not sorting this out. It's like, what on earth are you doing? Why do you bother going to work if you aren't stopping and thinking about those big picture issues? And especially, as we all know, it's been, you know, 50 odd years since we spotted the problem. It's not really okay, is it, to ignore it any longer? So no, I find it fascinating where those connections lie, and how even just in the last few minutes, you know, we're hearing about all these different ways it kind of joins together. I think just really briefly, I mean, two kind of specific examples, I guess, where in my world, kind of a transport world, I suppose, some of these rather crunchy moments happen in terms of failing to spot connectivity around things. Some of you will be aware, particularly those of you based anywhere near London, that there's a certain rather large rail project at the moment for which there's quite a lot of tunnelling that's been done, and there's quite a lot of stuff, you know, ready to roll, quite literally. And if you look at it in separate pieces in terms of what's been designed and what's actually been built, there's not a lot wrong with it. The problem comes when you put all those different systems together in a technical sense and you realise, oh, hang on a minute, doesn't actually all go together, does it? And especially as things get more complicated with more technologies involved and more digital pieces involved and so on, it's not just about designing a physical solution anymore. We've actually got to design a physical and a digital solution as well. And that actually, I think, is where we perhaps all need to just start to think a bit more consciously about how we might, you know, do things a bit differently, I suppose, in terms of that bigger systems thinking and so on. And the second thing that's just striking me, and I kind of knew this already, but it's amazing how it's coming through already just this afternoon, is my world is very much about traffic and cars and roads and buses and even e-scooters and all that kind of stuff now, all the cool new stuff that's coming through. But, and actually it's funny because cars are actually very like water, talking about water catchments and so on. There's an awful lot of stuff in terms of the modelling work that goes on in my world, where actually it's all about fluid mechanics and about how things, you know, how people are likely to behave and so on. Slightly different parameters, I guess, to do with, you know, the length of time it takes to make a journey. I guess the water drop doesn't really care how long it necessarily takes to get through a catchment, but as drivers we probably do, and you know, and so on. But it is really interesting, perhaps, to start to look at where those parallels lie and think about, you know, are there things we could be learning from each other across the different sectors to think differently about how we go about solving all these problems? Because the issues aren't going to go away. It's just how we go about tackling them, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Oh yeah, I remember doing some stuff on fluid mechanics actually in my degree, talking about traffic lights.
There you go. You missed
Of,
your calling, Niki. There you go. Never mind. Not too late.
most of the time, poor blimey. It's so interesting though, isn't it? I think when you look back to nature, I think in medicine it's the same, isn't it? You look back to nature often for the answers to a lot of our challenges. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And you are not an outlier. We are a broad church and you are extremely welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. Neil, do you fancy going next? And then we'll round it with Richard and we'll move forward a bit. Oh, can you hear me, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, congratulations to you as well. It seems a long time, 20 years since we sat opposite each other as junior environmentalists at Yorkshire Water. So, you know, excellent. I was reflecting really on why I've started thinking about systems thinking. And I think being a hydraulic modeler when I first started out and following pipelines and connecting them to reservoirs and then back to sources, I think really got me realizing that, you know, everything truly is interconnected there. And then I think, you know, in terms of the topic you mentioned, my reflections on perhaps why we don't always get it right, I think is because we're quite insular and we look at little bits and little components of the system, and it really does take a lot to lift yourself up and look at the whole system. And I think in terms then of some of the work I've been involved in with catchment management, you know, if we had a water quality problem, we would look to Rachel for a civil engineering solution. And, you know, and that's what we were very good at doing was building the fantastic solutions that we've got that give us great quality water. But we would look just at one point, and through some of the work I've been involved in, we've had to find different solutions, either because if it's something like the pesticide metaldehyde, we haven't been able to design an end of point solution for it that's both sustainable and economic. But also when you connect up the system, you start to look right up to where it's coming from. And I think part of the thing then is you need to go and have an open mind and speak to people. So we spoke to farmers and farmers said, well, we don't really want to put it on, but we need to ensure we've got a great crop for the end user. So then we went and talked to the end user, which in this case might be Birdseye or Jackson's, the bread producers. And they said, well, we would happily support the farmers to be more sustainable and not put it on. And suddenly you then connect up the whole system. And so the solution doesn't become about a single point. It's about a complete change in behaviours up in one part of the catchment that completely transforms the way the farming community operate. And it, if done correctly, I think it can benefit them and, you know, provide a huge benefit. We then don't have to build the treatment solution, and the end user, both in terms of the consumer of water, then benefits from a better solution, but also the end user in terms of the farm supply chain. We're getting a far better product that they could equally command a better premium from. But I think that would never have happened if we hadn't have gone with a very open mind and just started asking to all the different stakeholders, what is the real issue for you? And we've seen that. I'm sure we'll talk later about some, you know, some other scenarios. But that for me really struck me, that you have to come right up and consider all parties. And sometimes we're not great at that because we think of our little bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Neil. And we'll we'll definitely come on to the kind of barriers and challenges, because it's great to hear the examples of when it goes well, but I think it's really important, isn't it, to reflect on why it's tricky sometimes and be really honest about that, so that we can look at how to make it easier next time. So no, thank you, Neil. Richard, love to hear from you. In your garden, this is fantastic. I like it.
In the garden, well, partly because one of the challenges here is that not everything's connected and rural broadband is terrible. So I'm in fact right by my router here. Congratulations, Niki, and thank you so much for having me. And that kind of leads me on to a first couple of thoughts, actually, because thinking about how everything's connected made me think what's not connected. And actually there are some big examples of disconnection right at the moment that should be on all our minds. So yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the Lawson Review, which for those listening from Hong Kong and India is an important piece of research here in the UK that found that in order to restore ecosystems and allow nature to thrive, we need more places for nature that are bigger, better, and more joined up. And as we think now about how to restore nature in this country, that question about connecting small pockets of habitat, connecting up ponds with rivers, with floodplains, with right up to the uplands, that idea of reconnecting habitats that have been increasingly fragmented, not just by Rachel's roads, but by all sorts of different kinds of development, is I guess disconnection challenge number one. Another disconnection challenge in the ecological sphere, we often talk about the big risks to the natural environment, and there are sort of four horsemen of the ecological apocalypse of pollution, over-abstraction, invasive non-native species, and on top of E.O. Wilson's original list, lately people have been talking about a fifth horseman of the ecological apocalypse, which is people's disconnection from nature. And this is something that we've all been feeling much more lately, of course, during lockdown, with more and more people feeling that they've been hearing about the solace of access to natural green spaces, but for 2.6 million people here in the UK who don't have a garden, or for those people surrounded by air pollution or with no access to green space near them, disconnection from nature is really important, and that has huge physical and mental health disbenefits that we need to tackle. And I guess the third disconnection that I wanted to share with you guys today is that sort of systemic problem of cross-government disconnection. So one of the things we all bang our heads about constantly is why, if DEFRA knows what needs to happen, why aren't we factoring in the cost of environmental damage in our economic decision making? Why aren't we building these ideas about access to green space into the Department of Health? Big disconnects across government that need to be reconciled. But one of the messages that that we need to get out to the world at the moment, that's all about this point of connection and gives us a chance to try and turn things round, is that this crisis we're suffering right now, this global economic downturn that's leaving so many people facing uncertain futures, is all because of how connected our world is. First of all, it's because of how much anthropogenic damage to nature increases the risk of not just zoonotic disease like we're facing at the moment, but all sorts of other environmental risks, fire, flood, climate change. These are all because of the interconnectedness of people and nature, and that's the risks to that system. And of course, now more than ever before, that risk is multiplied globally because of the interconnectedness of society. So our economy is ultimately very, very connected and interdependent with that of China, with that of the US, and a problem that might seem once upon a time quite localized is spread worldwide in minutes. So this message that people are more interconnected than ever and that we're utterly dependent on nature and interconnected with it is absolutely fundamental in trying to heal some of those disconnections I started with. So only by explaining that dependence with nature and our connectedness with it can you start to solve these problems of habitat disconnection, people's disconnection from nature, and ultimately get the rest of government to listen to the Environment Department.
Oh, I'm hoping next Rich is going to tell us how to fix some of those things, particularly the DEFRA one. But thank you, Richard. No, that was really clear and really passionate. Thank you. We've sort of drifted into the kind of next question I was going to ask. I'm just doing a quick time check. We're going to take a comfort break in about 15 minutes, by the way, everybody. So just remind me. Somebody shout at me if we get to 4 o'clock and I've forgotten to do that. So we've kind of heard a little bit. We've heard a lot actually about what's happening in your world at the moment, what you're working on, what you're thinking about. We've drifted a little bit into the kind of where that's tricky. And Richard, I think you've teed that up beautifully in terms of where are the disconnects. I suppose when I was reflecting on this theme, and you know, it can seem a bit theoretical and a bit idealistic, although I'm nothing if not idealistic and enthusiastic. I guess I was interested in the reality of it, and I thought other people might be interested to hear from people like yourselves with a wealth of experience about, you know, real examples of when you have worked in a way that either has been brilliant at bringing connections together, and Neil started to mention one, and we've heard little bits, but also where it's really tricky, and because I think, gosh, we learn loads from failing, don't we? And so I guess it's really just trying to tease out some of those examples. So if you guys can just share a little bit, I know you've started to, but just share a little more around where it's gone well and where it's been tricky, and I guess what some of the learnings are that we can share with the wider community. So any volunteers? I'm not going to do the whole INRA bit. Oh, 2, look at that. Let's go Rob first, because we made Damien go first last time. All yours, Rob.
Thanks, Niki. And yes, sorry, I should have said congratulations as well at the start. So yeah, great stuff. As you said in my intro, I'm a geographer too. I did a physical geography degree, and at the time I not detested, but was really quite turned off by human geography. But as my career's progressed, I seem to have got more and more interested in the science and the study of how we behave and how we interact as a society with our environment. And from a water point of view, that's not just the kind of interaction with our wider environment, as Richard was just talking about. You know, I'm really, really lucky that I live a 10-minute walk from the River Taff and a canal feeder and a canal. So, you know, I can go and see some great water bodies and all the associated flora and fauna with that within 10 minutes. But also how we connect our water use with that environment. And, you know, the example that I always come back to is I love my in-laws dearly, obviously, but it wasn't until I came along as a hydrologist that I pointed out that the reservoirs that are on the way up from Cardiff to Brecon are actually where they get their water from. And, you know, you can see the penny dropping and that becoming a realisation that the two things were connected, that water on the A470 and the water that comes out of the tap. And I think, you know, one of the challenges with influencing how people use water is around making that connection. There's, you know, a lot of talk and, you know, several very strong vocal advocates of and critique people who criticise water companies, which a lot of it has got some basis, but at the end of the day, it's us as people who use water. And water companies have got an enormous amount to do to reduce leakage, but we've also got that responsibility. And so one of my big interests and big challenges and tricky areas that you mentioned for the next couple of years certainly is how we can influence people's water using behaviour in the right way. And there's lots to do there, because at the moment we talk about averages. So on average, we're told that everyone uses 142 litres of water per head per day, but actually that the distribution behind that is very skewed, and most people use quite a lot less than that. So, you know, our messages shouldn't be targeted to those people who are already quite water efficient. It should be to the people on the right hand side of that skewed distribution who are either profligate, who might legitimately have large properties and large houses and large number of people, but also might have a lot of unknown wastage, leaky loos and other plumbing losses. And so that discussion, that way of talking to people about water and water use needs to get a lot more nuanced, and that's a really tricky challenge. not obviously trying to plug us at Artesia too much, but one of the things that we had some brilliant news on last week is that we've just got funded for a knowledge transfer partnership project with the University of Manchester, where they've got some great social scientists who we've worked with before on this subject. And so again, that's a really good example of some collaboration where we're going to actually start to try and tackle that problem and produce some real world examples and guidance and toolkits and so on about how practitioners can talk to communities and talk to other professionals about how to effectively change water using behaviour without us hectoring, without us talking about units that no one knows about, and so on. So that's a big challenge. I think it's something that we've had some insights into over the last few years, but there's still an awful lot to do.
Yeah, that's I couldn't agree more, as you know, Rob, because I just penned an article with a colleague Andrew at Thames on exactly that. I think there is something about, and actually, Richard, you talked about it, that disconnect between people and systems. And if you're like, we're all pretty geeky about this kind of stuff and we're all right with that, but actually if this isn't your jam, then why would you know that, or why would you even think about where your water comes from? In the same way, we probably don't really think how our electricity gets to us or what the transmission system looks like, or because we're thinking about other things. And actually I was just reflecting, like, from a circular economy perspective, it's all about reducing consumption. Well, actually, there's got to be a why bother. There's got to be a compelling need, and that's got to be in, as you say, I couldn't agree more, language that isn't litres per head per day, or whatever. It's got to be in something that makes sense and is meaningful, and people, we've got to stop talking to ourselves, and we've got to start thinking about how we communicate with everybody else that is less geeky and really than the rest of us. So no, I'm totally
that just to mention as well that David in his introduction mentioned about connecting with people's hearts and making emotional calls to, and we've got to find those right words to make that connection and to affect that change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. No, thanks. That's a really pertinent one. Damien, you volunteered to go first as well, so I'm going to come to you next if that's okay, and then I might come to Richard just to give you a heads up. So.
Thanks, Niki. So the example I draw on is that over the last decade, I've led the Environment Agency's development of the catchment-based approach, CABA, as it's known, and for our international audience, this is recognised globally now as quite unique in its national scale and coverage and level of support, and it aims to drive improvements in water quality, flood risk management and habitat restoration. But when we were setting it up 10 years ago, I recognised this as a systems approach problem, and I drew on some postgraduate research I did in my 20s on systems analysis. So invited some systems researchers to help us in the design and development of this catchment-based approach. And that the focus was on making connections between researchers, policymakers and practitioners through evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. This is a concept from the health sector. And what we wanted to do was explore the connections in the system between the public sector, the private sector and civil society. So that, from a public sector perspective, we need to know where the policy levers are and the intervention points in the system. From the private sector, they need to know where they can create value in the system from those opportunities and interlinkages. And then from a civil society perspective, they're interested in who they can be collaborating with to drive this innovation and improving system resilience. So we started out with 25 pilots and we rolled it out across the country from 2013. We've now got over 100 catchment partnerships, full national coverage. There's more than 2,500 organisations involved from public, private and civil society sectors. Over 20,000 stakeholders are engaged on an annual basis, delivering around 1,000 projects a year. So it is a success story in its own right. But we've still got a long way to go to keep this up. And over that decade, the conclusions I've drawn from this experience are that there are some principles for good catchment management, the ABCs. So A, it needs to be adaptive. So we need to acknowledge complexity, time, natural and social variability. B, it needs to be balanced. We need to accommodate diverse, legitimate, conflicting interests of multiple stakeholders in the catchment. And C, it needs to be coordinated. We need to acknowledge the need to account for the interdependencies across the catchment system. And that is not always easy because, as it's been said earlier, government departments can and sometimes do operate in systemic silos. So bridging across those silos from policy to practice throughout the system, you know, vertically and horizontally, is a real challenge sometimes. And the difficulty with a systems approach is it's not easy to measure, it's not easy to operationalize, and it's very difficult for decision makers to understand where they need to intervene.
Yeah, no, well, what an exciting, I feel like at the end of this, when we wrap all this together, we might need to nick loads of links from you guys and post them all, because I'm sure there'll be lots of people that want to hear more about the things that you're starting to talk about. Do you know, it's an interesting one, that I couldn't agree more, Damien, and particularly the, how do you measure it? Because that is one of the trickies, isn't it? But it's what drives business at the moment. And if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it, and you can't, you know, but sometimes the impact is in a different part of the system to where the cost is felt. And like, I felt that personally. In fact, working with Neil, when we used to manage bioresources and wastewater treatment operations, and, you know, the cost appeared somewhere in Neil's P&L, and I was the one spending the money quite often. So yeah, it happens, doesn't it? You've got to be joined up to be okay with that. So I'm conscious of time. What I think I might do is just press pause, if that's all right. We'll take a 4-minute, I think Jane tells me, which is brilliant, a 4-minute bio break. We'll come back at 4 o'clock, and I'll come back with Richard and Rachel and Neil will ask you the same question, if that's okay. So brilliant energy, guys. Thank you so much. And now I will see you all in 4 minutes. I make that 4 o'clock, so I'm sure Rob will be back with us in a second. So I think we'll get started again. Just before we I come to you, Richard, I just thought I'd remind people as well, if you want to take part in today's conversation, we would love you to. So head to slido.com, slido.com, and the code is C34. We've got a few questions coming through, which is great. So there's a Q&A button. If you want any questions for the panel, pop your question in there. Or if you agree with somebody else's question, you want to make sure I ask it, then vote for it and it'll get to the top of the list. And there's also an ideas tab, and we've just got one really big, simple question. What actions can we take together now as CIWEM members to meet the challenges of the climate and ecological emergency? And maybe like less than 50, go for it, guys. But genuinely, we're really interested in kind of what are we doing already, but really, what else should we be doing in your view? And it's not just for today, so we'll gather all of those responses and then we'll reflect on them as an institution, and we'll also share them out more generally. So if you're listening to this in the future, then you'll be able to head to the website and see all of those as well. So do keep engaging with us, because it's lovely to hear from people that are out there. So without further ado, Richard, we were at a point where we were saying, what are the trickies, what's worked well? Give us some examples. Would you be able to share a little with us?
Yeah, the tricky bits are sometimes when we forget as conservationists and environmentalists this message about connection. And I think often for those who look at our sector and listen to our movement, there's nothing more frustrating than when we are disconnected from one another. So the prospect of having the guys with a panda on a badge disagreeing with the guys with an avocet on a badge, or vying for space with the guys with a badger on a badge. This is something that really puts folk off, and more than that, sometimes a sort of reductionist approach to our policy and campaigning can lead to real problems. So if, for example, we push the climate message to the expense of nature, or vice versa, you get to some of these classic perverse outcomes. So we've all heard of the bogeymen of diesel cars coming to reduce emissions and ending up hurting people's health, or trees being planted in upland wetlands to try and sequester carbon and ending up ruining your peat bog. So that kind of disconnection is where it really doesn't work, and that reductionism. But it feels like we're entering a time of hope, actually. I've never known a time when conservationists have worked together more closely than they are now, united by the common threats. My organisation works really closely with several other coalitions, Greener UK and Green Alliance, and you might think that we'd be vying for space. We're not. We love working together, and I'm here today because CIWEM is the outstanding professional body at working with others. And Alistair on your team there is just absolutely brilliant at reaching out and forging unusual connections. And that's where you make progress. There's nothing more impactful from a government minister than having a professional body in a room with a traditionalist conservation organisation, you know, National Trust with a scone, sitting alongside Greenpeace, preferably with somebody with dyed hair who's just come in from a direct action, and being able to say that professional bodies and the traditionalists and the outliers are united on a piece of work really makes the difference. So that was the case on things like the work against fracking, or work we've done on even things like urban drainage with CIWEM. Great coalition work. And the other exciting hope on the agenda, to just turn back to the policy problem that I introduced before, is, I guess, although the idea of natural capital may be quite divisive in some ways, some people think that, you know, it's putting a price on nature, or trying to value something that should be intrinsically appreciated. If there's one sort of underlying message of natural capital, it is that you have to do systems thinking to improve the environment, and that you can't deal with biodiversity separately from water, separately from air. And that message has really started to filter through in the government's 25-year plan, and in the Environment Bill, where hopefully for the first time we'll set a set of comprehensive environmental targets to lead to overall improvement, rather than picking and choosing one separately. And you see the system as a whole. There's even a legal duty in the Environment Bill that the Secretary of State must take a systems approach to setting environmental targets in future. There's a long way to go to make it good enough. We need to make sure that that's advised by independent advisors and tech expertise, and not just at the whim of the Secretary of State, but it's a really great step forward. So I'm hopeful that this kind of approach will take root.
Oh, yeah, fingers crossed. It's extraordinary to hear that that's in, isn't it, I think? And I've been chatting to colleagues the last few days around the Environment Bill, and you know, Rob's area of expertise around water, and moving from a per capita consumption measure to something that's much more about, you know, total water that we use, and thinking about how much we abstract, and not just for household and business, but for all of the water. You know, if we move to a hydrogen economy, we're going to need a lot of water to make hydrogen, which is coming from the same places often that makes drinking water. So ultimately, to move towards a greener future, we've got to be joining the dots between, and that's where, you know, Rachel may feel that she is an outlier, but, you know, transport, energy, water, that whole, you know, food, all of the solutions sit within the things that are within our control, don't they, really? But sorry, not about me, could wax lyrical, won't agree is what I'm saying. Brill. So thank you, Richard. Rachel, would you like to come in on this one?
Yeah, sure. I was actually just going to flag up an absolute standout example from my time in the industry, where to me it felt like, despite all sorts of potential for stuff to go horribly wrong, somehow it kind of just didn't, or at least we kind of swept the stuff that could have gone wrong under the carpet and just got on with it. And that actually, it was the Olympics. It was the 2012 Olympics, and it still stands out, even though obviously it's 8 years ago now, isn't it? But the run up to that, and I suppose it was the kind of 2 or 3 year run up to that. It wasn't just the kind of the couple of weeks beforehand. I was pretty heavily involved in the transport side of things, in terms of not just the sort of central London side of things, but also in terms of thinking through how we go about managing, you know, individual sites all over the country, and how you'd actually come up with a plan that would make sure that everything worked and it all went together. And obviously that was just one tiny bit of the whole bigger Olympic endeavour that was going on, as many of you will remember, all over the country at that time. So I was trying to think, as I was just listening to you know, others a few minutes ago, really, what was it about that A, made it jump to mind when you just asked that question, but secondly, why did it work as it did? And I think actually part of the reason in that case, and maybe it was quite unique in that respect, is because it had a hard deadline. There was literally no way that, you know, Great Britain was going to announce to the world that they were terribly sorry, but the Olympics were going to be happening, you know, not quite on schedule, but maybe a little bit later. And it's funny now, you roll forward to obviously what's going on in terms of COVID and the fact that we have very much got those kinds of things going on, but for very different reasons. At the time, it was very much the perception that this was in our gift to get right. There was a hard deadline. It did have to happen. Everybody did have to just get the stuff done. And I think actually there was something about that that made it feel like all those different pieces really were part of a collective effort and part of a team. And you kind of understood where your bit fitted in that bigger picture, and it really mattered, because you knew that if your bit went wrong, it had the potential, you know, to be a real problem in the grand scheme of things. So I suppose that just led me on to just thinking and kind of, I guess, just posing a sort of question back to others, really. You know, are there ways that we could do that better around other programs and projects now? Because we always talk about, you know, all these different crisis points we've got, don't we? We've mentioned them all in this conversation already today, haven't we? You know, you've got COVID, which is kind of the crisis of right now, and you've got all the pieces around Brexit, you've got climate change, you've got all these different things going on. Okay, so, you know, in our own little way, what are we going to do to actually start to address these and stop saying things like, oh, we're going to only have one crisis at a time? Well, I'm sorry, but crises aren't like that. You know, they're a little bit more like buses, I guess, in my world. You know, several can turn up at once. You just have to kind of get on with it, I guess. So no, I guess there's, for me, there's some really interesting food for thought there in terms of what made that different. And what made that significant, I suppose. And just briefly, I would wholeheartedly agree with others who've already said that the place where things can go horribly wrong, it is very much around the people and the engagement and the collaboration and the messaging. You know, not just to the general public, but also to other expert stakeholders and consultees and so on. If we don't all explain ourselves properly, if we don't explain what we're trying to do, if we don't talk about the trade-offs, which there will be, you know, in hiding and lurking in the weeds and all the rest of it, if we don't actually explain that clearly, is it any surprise that these things get derailed, and all this time and energy and effort and cost and all the rest of it, you know, tends to get sort of, you know, racked up in terms of just trying to get to the end result. So, I mean, I guess, I mean, I'm like you, Niki. I'm always the optimist in terms of trying to get to this sort of, you know, sort of better future view and all the rest of it. It strikes me that there's just a massive opportunity, and it is one around collaboration again for everybody across all of our sectors, to just get so much better at explaining what we do and talking about what we do and making it relevant to the passing, burning bandwagons, instead of just constantly trying to sort of sell our own message in isolation, because frankly, no one's going to listen. We're just, as we said before, we're talking to ourselves, aren't we? So yes, lots of thoughts there.
And I wonder whether, you know, I talked about the sort of diversity and inclusion challenge that we have in the sector. I wonder whether that becomes the part of the solution, actually, because the kind of people that are, the skills that you need to be good at the stuff that we're already doing well are not often the same people as the skills you need to be able to communicate that well. And that's no criticism of either group, we're just different, aren't we? And so, and I wonder whether in the get your head down, do the engineering, do the science, you know, we might need to recruit more broadly, I guess is the point, to make sure that we are genuinely representative of our communities, and then we can communicate with those communities.
Exactly right. Just to build on that very briefly, I think my other thought on that is, I think you're absolutely right. And very often we've trained people into a certain way of thinking and a certain skill set and so on. It doesn't mean they can't do other things. It just means they haven't necessarily tried, or they haven't had the opportunity or whatever. I love it when you see people who have sort of, you know, taken one path and then all of a sudden, you know, they realize they can in fact do other things well as well. And I think you're absolutely right. Those softer skills are very much in demand. And I even hate saying, you know, the phrase soft skills, because they're not soft at all. They're actually pretty tricky things to get right. But when we do, life just gets so much easier, doesn't it? There's such a huge opportunity there to do things better, and absolutely to do it together.
No, I love it. No, I couldn't agree more. Neil, I think, and forgive me if I forget who I've spoken to. It's just, you know, forgive me, shout. But Neil, I don't think we've come to you on this one, so we'll hear from you, and then we'll move on to the kind of final question, if that's all right.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I'll talk about an example that I'm not directly involved with, but the company I work for are, and I hope it's additive to kind of what's gone before. But for those who don't know, Hull is on the east coast of Yorkshire, and it mainly sits below ground level, which it probably doesn't take an environmentalist or an engineer to work out means that it will at times flood. And of course it did back in, I think it was 2007 was the last really bad example. And everybody, all agencies and partners looked at each other and said, well, we're all fulfilling our statutory duty, but the problem's not going away. It's getting worse with population growth and climate change. And I think what happened was we just put lots of people in a room under the sort of banner of living with water. And what that did was created very diverse thinking. And by that, I mean, if you'd have just put the engineers and the environmental scientists in a room, you would have probably come up with a land-based or a civil engineering-based solution. But once you connect up the local authority and other social stakeholders within that area, you start to get people expressing what their problems are. And so once you then stood back and looked and said, well, the problem is that we're getting water in Hull, but actually the problem is also that there's a lot of social deprivation. There are no blue-green spaces within the city, and health is an issue in there as well. If you sort of then turn that around and say, well, what's a solution that might address lots of those things? You come up with the sort of living with water concept, which is engage with the population, change the landscape to be green, to hold the water back, to create different spaces. And then you ultimately avoid, you reduce the risk of flooding, but you create a very different system, in which people can live and operate. And by doing that, I think you also then access different resources. And by that, I guess, I mean, in this sense, the financial resources, that if you can then transfer some of the health budget, which is being used at the sort of end point of the problem, and invest that at the front, you can make a huge change because you're getting access to different things. But I think part of the issue is it takes an enormous amount of, you've got to be very bold to do it. Nobody wants to say, I'll give up my budget on the off chance that this may work. And I think we've seen that replicated, that it's very simple to fix a problem with a sort of a hard solution because you've got certainty that it will work. But trusting in catchment solutions that may take a long time to develop and not have the same level of certainty takes an awful lot of commitment. And I think what I'd highlight there is that in that example, you've got a huge corporation in Yorkshire Water, you've got the Environment Agency, you've got the various Hull and the East Riding councils. You've got all the key stakeholders. If you flip to West Yorkshire, where I am now, we've got flooding for a completely different reason. We live in a very steep-sided valley. You've got a small community-based project, Pennine Prospects, trying to do exactly the same. And they've been going at this now for 10 years, trying to connect up health, social well-being, land management, restoring peatland. And there are so many different stakeholders involved. And without that sort of big corporation driving it, I've seen how difficult it is. And they've had some fantastic successes, I should say, but I've seen how difficult it is for them to get going. And it's also difficult to keep people engaged when you're trying to meet so many different needs. Because, I think as Rachel says, we're all quite good with a crisis because something's happened and so we can leap on it and deal with it. And I think that's the really hard thing, is keeping people engaged in these more difficult solutions. But there's definitely examples of success. And I think it is really important that, the bigger corporations, and I take that further and say the shareholders and the boards who are kind of governing really need to start thinking about that far more. So I think somebody had asked the question, what can members of CIWEM do about this? Well, we're probably all members of corporations. I think we can keep asking and challenging our boards and wider stakeholders to really think about this.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, well, I guess that beautifully segues onto the sort of final question I had for you all, I guess, really, which is, and you've given me some beautiful examples. Neil started to talk about there, actually, what more could we do? I am as I once said in a job interview, which extraordinarily I actually got the job. I said, if you want a blue sky thinker, do not appoint me. That is not my bag, which I think surprised the interviewer, but he still gave me the job. But I said, if you want somebody to turn an idea into action, that is where I like to play. And so I'm really interested in that space with you guys. So we've heard about stuff that's gone well, and we've heard about why some of it is tricky, and just reflecting on some of the things and the themes I've heard so far: collaboration, digital solutions, embedding things like a systems approach into policy, hard deadlines, really interesting. It's like the government equivalent of homework on the back of the bus, Rachel, isn't it? Engagement, following the money, thinking about skills. Like there's a huge raft of really interesting things happening there. I suppose I'm interested in your respective institutions, organisations. What are you as organisations and you as individuals planning on doing? And I guess on the back of that, are there any calls to action that you would want to share with our 100 and how many people? 101 people listening at the moment, and the wider audience that listens back. So anyone want to go first? Damian, please do. Great. Yeah, thank you.
So I've been scribbling down, and I'd like to quote Bart Simpson, but make a bit of a modification on that. People are the cause of and the answer to all the world's problems, right? The problem is managing change is difficult, and people are very, very complicated. So making this step towards collaboration is not going to be easy. And managing change is hard, and leadership is even harder. So my organisation is run by a man that believes in very strong leadership, but we will be totally reliant on the CIWEM network to give us that support and the connection to the various critical points in the system that we need to just nudge it over that tipping point to get everyone to move in the same direction. Thank you.
Great, Damien, thank you. I love that you created Bart Simpson as well. That's fantastic, or almost. Brilliant. Well, there's a direct for our members. Who fancies going next? Who can I eyeball? Neil, feel free. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a reflection actually that everything I've seen throughout my sort of 20 years has not come from a big corporation or a body or something else. It's come from a person saying, I want to do something about this. And that's, that's the same in Hull. There's something we're doing at the moment, which is to try and re-engineer the catchment where we are, and we're connecting into the community. And the point is, it's being driven by one person who's just really passionate about it. And so I think, with 100 people here who will all have ideas, my encouragement would be that, speak up. If you don't get heard first time, keep speaking up, because eventually there are people like you and me, Niki, who are great at then nicking other people's ideas and helping say, yeah, right, we can make this happen. And I think, that's the thing. There are people around who just know when the time is right and the opportunity is right to then, connect in with the latest policy or the bit of funding or the sort of latest investment trends. So, yeah, I would just make sure that, be very action oriented, I think, because people are what make a difference, not the big corporations.
Yeah, I'm still getting over the fact you tarred me with your own brush there. It's probably Steal with pride as a consultant. Yeah. No, thank you, Neil. There is something about action, isn't there? Rob, do you fancy sharing your thoughts with us next? That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really echoes what Damien and Neil have said already. The sort of things that I jotted down in my little mind map around this is, this sort of thing does come down to leaders and champions who really feel passionately about something, because it's that kind of passion and enthusiasm that drives this forward. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it is really, really hard work. And I don't think, we probably tend to paint it, or see things a little bit through rose-tinted spectacles. But, just going to Rachel's example of the Olympics, one of my best friends was actually worked for LOCOG and organised all of the cycling events. And I mean, in terms of work and the challenge of doing that and collaborating massively across all of the different London authorities, different cycling bodies, etc., it was just an incredible challenge. And yeah, he had the biggest hard deadline, or the earliest hard deadline of all, because the men's road race was on the first day. So yeah, it needs a champion, it needs a leader, and it needs some vision to deliver all that hard work. And I think, you know, the theme, as I said when we spoke earlier in the week, Niki, the theme of everything's connected is something that resonates very strongly with us here at Artesia, and we've kind of had it as a bit of a motto, although not copyrighted or anything, over the last few years. And yeah, it goes back to the point you made about the targets around consumption or abstraction. You know, let's look at it from what really matters, what comes out of the environment, because at the end of the day, that's what we're kind of all driven by and all motivated by. That's what gets our blood pumping and gets us up in the morning. But also, you know, you do have to sweat the small stuff. You know, that's probably another one of our mottos, not an official one, but we kind of try and solve complex problems and don't mind getting our hands dirty in a data sense, at least. And again, that is hard and tricky and complicated, and you end up, you know, down statistical and data engineering science type avenues that an old-fashioned physical geographer like me would probably not prefer to be in. But you know, if you're going to change things, then you have to get fairly down in the weeds, as Rachel said. And I think that applies to whatever any one of us has talked about, whether it's a policy thing that Richard will wax lyrical on, whether it's the engagement across the different stakeholders in Hull, as Neil was saying, and all of the catchment stuff and so on from Damian. You know, it's kind of the hard yards that are important, and don't shy away from it. But you know, because the rewards are very, very good at the end of it. And you know, I think, you know, we're all CIWEM members, and we're CIWEM members because we believe passionately in the environment. So you know, it's a great vocation that we should that should drive us all on, you know, regardless, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely, except Rachel, who's not a CIWEM member. ICE, we're coming for her. Right, Rachel, do you fancy going next?
Yeah, very good. So in terms of, I guess, one specific example that I'd love to sort of shamelessly plug with all of you this afternoon, from an ICE point of view, and specifically around the theme of net zero carbon, one of the things that we kicked off on the 1st of July is a thing called the Carbon Project, because it's kind of intended as a bit of a run up to my year and trying to do exactly, Niki, what you were asking about in the question, turning all this fine talk about how urgent and important it is that we get on and do something into actual proper action that will actually properly make an actual difference. So essentially, I mean, I won't bore you silly with all the detail now, because you can look up some of the things online if any of you are interested. I would welcome anybody's involvement. Essentially, the idea is that before we, as I guess the ICE community, the civil engineering sort of broad church community, starts going around the place and telling everybody else that they have to get on board with this whole thing around climate change and all the rest of it, it felt like we needed to get our own house in order. And there were 3 big things that we decided we really needed to do, where it felt that civil engineering in the round had some work to do to figure out, you know, what is the best way of doing this particular thing? What are the gaps we're going to try and fill? You know, what can we contribute so that when we go and talk to other people about it, we can actually say, aha, as a professional community, we are in fact in a position to guide and sort of suggest things, even if not mandate, but at least to offer something in a technical and kind of content kind of sense. So the 3 things that we're looking at the moment, and maybe some of these will be relevant to some of you, I sincerely hope so, is a piece around measurement, on the basis that everybody talks about needing to understand, you know, whether or not things are carbon neutral, or what the carbon footprint is of something, or have we achieved net zero on this particular project, whatever it might be. But actually, if we're honest, there are so many different ways of measuring things right now that we don't often know where we're starting from. We certainly don't know quite what we're aiming for, and therefore we probably have very little idea whether or not we're on the right track to achieve things, whether that's the 2050, you know, UK hard legally binding target, or whether that's the specifics of a particular project or a particular sector or a particular company or whatever it might be. Second one is about skills and codes and standards and so on, and just trying to rationalize some of the stuff in terms of actually what do we all need to know about? What should the sort of some of the I guess the rules be in terms of how we go about designing and building things differently? Because otherwise there is very, very little guidance actually in a real sense, in a technical sense, that's out there yet. And the third one, not surprisingly perhaps, is around the systems thinking piece, and trying to make sure that we are considering things in the round and that we are consciously making sure we think about all of that. So far, I mean, we've got, I don't know, probably 30 plus different organizations involved in various different ways, clients, consultants, contractors, and so on. And I'm really hopeful that actually when you put all those things together, we might start to generate a sort of a consensus and a bit of a direction of travel in terms of saying, right, if we just all start to do things a bit more like this, we might actually get somewhere. And I think, to me, that is really exciting in terms of action. So it won't get done in a year, of course. I'll be long out of post by the time we probably get there. But my job, I think, for the coming year or so is to try to, you know, get that tanker going in the direction that it should be. Terrible analogy when it comes to carbon, but there we go. Anyway, but no, you'll all be very welcome to join in. Please look out for it. And if you want to know more, maybe that's one of the links, Niki, that you could send that afterwards.
That's brilliant, Rachel. I'm just going to say that. Let's definitely do that. That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'm sure people would be very keen to get involved. Thank you. So last but not least, Richard.
Thank you so much. I guess I've been sitting here thinking about the different ways that you can embed system thinking and making a resolution as I listen to others, because there are two that are our bread and butter at Wildlife and Countryside Link from day to day. We often think about the role of regulation and saying the law must make sure that we make these connections. We must regulate to ensure that climate change or nature are taken into account in decision making. That's one we do every day. Another one we do every day or think about every day is to, well, to quote Homer Simpson again, dope the money and making sure that environmental externalities are factored into decision making, and that kind of green economic thread through that leads from right up from those super tankers to the decisions on the supermarket shelf, or even to people's water and electricity meters to help them make more intelligent decisions. Those two we think about every day, but I guess the bit that sometimes we forget about is the embedding and habituating these ideas of systems thinking in people's communities, and helping to reconcile the implications of green choices with people's other priorities in life. And things like the catchment approach that we've heard a lot about from partners today, so important in helping to bring together those top-down ecological priorities with people's day-to-day experience of what the land is like. And as I was thinking about that point about the 2012 Olympics, a lot of it was about a hard deadline. We like that in regulation too. Let's put a target date in there and make government do it. But a lot of it again was about community. And actually one of the abiding and interesting things about why the Olympics worked and why it became a national moment was that leadership that created all those the games makers and those communities that kept on meeting for months and years afterwards. They were still meeting in Hyde Park just before lockdown to have a post-Olympics jamboree. And that was a great example of how forging a collective sense of vision around a shared endeavour can become embedded in people's ways of thinking and last long after the event itself. We've got a moment like that now with the sort of Blue Planet, David Attenborough moment. There's a sense of energy in the environment sector like I've never known it before. And the task for us is to think about how to make sure that that's embedded for everybody every day, so that when the Extinction, the Facts goes off Netflix, we all remember what it's really about. And partnership working and that link to community is fundamental to that. And that's what I'm going to take away today.
That's brilliant, Richard. Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely heard that too. Absolutely. It's about communities, a great way of putting it, really. I think we're going to move to questions because there's a really nice link between that and the first question. So Jane, if you're able to pop the Slido questions up for me, that would be fab. So thanks to those of you who've engaged and put questions through. Mr. McHugh, you've still got my necklace on, so I'm kind of thinking, you know, we can still ask you to do a little bit for us, can't we? I wondered if you fancied answering the first question that has had a few votes, which is, so glad that somebody likes the theme, few. Who are the communities and organisations that CIWEM would like to connect with? And I guess I just wondered if I've got a view, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, David, on that.
Sure, thanks, Niki. It's kind of you to call on the immediate past president to comment from CIWEM. So look, in terms of connectivity, and I think back to when CIWEM made its own declaration of a climate and ecological emergency last year and made its 7 pledges, and connectivity was indeed part of that as well. To connect with organizations. And I think for us in CIWEM, there was an intent to go beyond where, you know, our usual connections of the professional institutions. We've got well-established connections in the political world and with the civil service, and these are all very important. But we do need to connect with other organizations. And, you know, one of your panelists has made the point that, you know, we have a good history of connecting with organizations beyond our sphere. I think we need to push that even further. You know, we have well-established connections within the professional institutions and let's use them, but we need to push ourselves beyond our comfort zone. There's a lot of people, a lot of communities with the same objective. And we need to find commonalities and ways of working together towards that common goal.
No, thank you, David. I really agree. I guess the only thing I would build is we have a branch network in CIWEM, and that's like for some of us, certainly for me, like the shout out to the Tyne and Humber branch and Mike who chairs that. That's how I got involved. And actually, branches are really at the heart of kind of a lot of what we do. So there's something for me about how do our local branches connecting with our local communities as well, and really use those perhaps even more than we already have done, I think, to drive some of this for us. So thank you, David, that's brilliant. So Paul has asked, what do we think about Wellbeing and Future Generations Act 2015 and the Environment Act 2016 that puts ecosystems and Welsh people at the heart of policy? I'm wondering, maybe Richard might want to take this, or Rob, not sure who. I'm going to have a look and see if anyone's nodding. Well, you're both going okay. Oh, I couldn't see who that was. Jump in, whoever that was. You've got your mic off, please.
Hi there, Niki. Yeah, I don't know the legislation in detail, but as a Welsh resident, I'm encouraged and sort of very positive about the messages I've heard both from other CIWEM members and organisations from Welsh Water down, really, about how integrated and effective it is in driving decision making and policy. And my understanding is, you know, it really is quite visionary by putting future generations' well-being at the heart of that process. So Richard probably knows more than me from a policy regulation perspective, but no, I see it as a really strong positive move and something that should be encouraged more as we, you know, try and move away from, you know, continual GDP growth and all the rest of it to something that's more sustainable.
No, thank you. Richard, did you want to come in?
No, I agree with Rob. It was, both acts were excellent in their time. All I'd say is I hope that the Welsh Parliament and the other devolved nations will go further. This is one of those examples where devolution can be a sort of race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. And Wales got in there early with future generations, but it's not as strong as it could be. So the Future Generations Commissioner is an individual with a small office who doesn't have the powers to, for example, take legal action if the Welsh Government's not as good as it should be. The principles in there are quite generally framed around things like sustainable development rather than setting hard goals for where Wales needs to get to. So Wales did a great thing in really starting to drive forward this natural environment legislation. Now Westminster government's taken a step forward with the Environment Bill, and I hope that we'll see continuing ratcheting up of ambition over time.
Thank you, Richard. No, that's great. And you answered my question. I was like, oh, well, what can they not do? So that's perfect. Thank you for sharing. It's fascinating. I think we'll take, how are we doing for time? We'll take a couple more at least. So Jeff's asked, how do we think we can achieve real world change when the pandemic is driving disconnection, distancing and isolation in a global political way? That is a big one. Anyone fancy taking a crack at it? I can't see everybody at the moment. Forgive me. Let me just... Neil, brilliant. Go for it, please.
I'll give a really little answer to a really big question, but I think it's more around the fact that I might not have the answer, but I think the opportunities here, we talk all the time in Yorkshire about the drought of '95 being the sort of burning platform that created a huge change for us. And if I relate it to sort of first Hebden Bridge and Pennine Prospects, that Pennine Prospects has been trying to connect up 16 different unitary council authorities in what's called the South Pennines area. It never became a national park, but if you think district, it's as beautiful an area covering about as much land, but it hasn't got the designation. Trying to get a diverse community, and it is an incredibly diverse community that lives around the area. It's very industrial heritage, mixed with sort of farming and upland kind of landscape, and then loads of suburban commuters. Well, the pandemic has sort of broken down all those barriers. So, now within this community, there are lots of shops that are not using plastic, moving away from single-use plastic. There are loads of local producers now selling direct, creating their own little market economy. And there are people cycling from, diverse backgrounds and less well-off areas in an area that for 15 years we've been trying to work out how do you encourage people in, and suddenly it's happening. So I think now it's, you've got to build on that. You've got to not let it go back, and that's a huge opportunity. And I guess just to take it away from a kind of sort of Hebden-centric place, I spent last week in Croydon working down there. And I think what I observed there was that, again, you've got a community now where lots of people who would never have seen each other, unless they were on a packed tube going into London, are now working from home or passing by. And again, it was just really interesting observing how a community is totally having to reorganize itself around this. And of course, the same will then have to happen to our cities. But so I think you're right. There is a danger. It's back to the very first point I made. If we do that in our usual isolated way, we'll end up with a very sort of sub-optimized outcome. But if we think really cleverly about it now and take the opportunity that the sort of terrible global pandemic has presented us, I think there are some real opportunities for people's social well-being, for communities to thrive, to get rid of lots of the food miles we travel, or of course the commuter miles we travel, and get some green solutions in. So I guess this is the opportunity where CIWEM, this is the time to sort of bring together all those skillful people who are able to make the change happen, and be very active about it. I think that's what we need to do.
No, thank you, Neil. So I think this is amazing. You can't see this, guys, but everyone is saying, yes, I've got something to say. Rachel, I think, dropped me a message to say she wanted to add something first. So we'll go to Rachel and then I'll come to Damien and then Richard. Thank you.
You've picked a panel who simply won't be quiet, but there we go, that's fine. No, I think it's a really interesting question, this one, isn't it? I think a lot of what we're seeing right now around COVID, and I know we've kind of been living with it here now for 6 odd months or whatever, but a lot of this stuff is short-term reactions, isn't it? We've kind of done the knee-jerk, and now it feels that actually we have a real opportunity to kind of reset and figure out what we actually want, because I think what COVID has shown us, it has shown us actually some of the things we do want. It's also shown us some of the things we don't want, as we saw perhaps in the questioning part, but actually really interesting in a sort of a social science kind of a way and a people kind of a way. And this is where I point out that I'm a human geographer of the conversation as opposed to the physical one, but there we go. But actually, I think it also, I think it's really opened our eyes to the things that we just kind of did without thinking about it, which really weren't ideal, but which we just kind of tolerated. I mean, things like that busy commute that Neil just mentioned, for example, the commuting time, the cost, all that kind of thing. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that we're going to be heading towards a world where nobody goes out and you know, needs to get to work in a physical sense, because of course there are many roles that absolutely, you know, that is essential if we're going to keep our sort of core systems and so on running. But I think it has really opened people's eyes to the way that we could do things differently, whether it's, you know, work related or home related, or I don't know, leisure, or it doesn't matter, it could be anything, couldn't it? I think it's also given us a newfound respect for a lot of the people who actually, you know, we really do rely on. And I think it perhaps will bring together, you know, different segments of society in different ways going forward. So like I say, a real chance to kind of reset things and maybe start to change the way our places work and the way that, you know, the way that we go about our everyday life and so on. So a chance perhaps to reinvent our cities, partly through need now, because obviously, you know, we're seeing the economic impacts and so on, but also partly through opportunity, but also to reinvent some of our more rural areas and less connected areas, and breathing new life into some of those in a way that makes them, I suppose, more genuinely sustainable in kind of all senses of the word, you know, economic, social and environmental, as we go forward. So to me, really, and it's easy to say because you kind of say, well, yes, of course, you can say that with the benefit of 6 months of hindsight, but I really think that COVID is one of these burning bandwagon crisis moments that we absolutely, as a whole sort of technical community, need to hook into and just actually figure out, you know, what do we want from it? What are we going to do about this? If we're saying that, you know, the distancing and disconnection is a problem, okay, so come on then, how do we reset? And we're in a position to make change. I think it's quite exciting actually in terms of the potential for fast change now.
Yeah, no, I'd agree, Rachel. Thank you. Damien, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. In June this year, an organisation called Locality produced a report on their assessment of local capacity in the light of COVID-19 pandemic and community responses. The report was called "We Were Built for This" and how community organisations helped us through the coronavirus crisis. And 4 key conclusions that they arrived at from that assessment was that existing social infrastructure has been vital to the crisis response. Secondly, well-functioning local systems have emerged in the heat of the crisis. Thirdly, the role of community organisations as cogs of connection have been strengthened. And the 4th point was that long-term support is needed by government to maintain and improve community connections and collaborations. And you can download that. It's Locality 2020.
Brilliant, Damien. Thank you. And we'll grab that link off you. We'll make sure we share that afterwards with everybody as well. That's really succinct, isn't it? Beautiful. Richard, do you want to come in on this one as well? I think you said you did. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll try and be succinct too. If everybody can do one thing, it would be respond to the Treasury's call for evidence on the comprehensive spending review next week, at least for those who are in the UK, because this is, as Rachel just said, a massive moment for opening people's eyes about the need for systems thinking, integrating nature and the rest of the world. We've got to have the money to run catchment partnerships. We've got to have the investment in rivers and streams to turn around the state of our water quality. We've got to have right now the investment in governance that will be needed to do local nature recovery strategies that will be absolutely vital for catchment regeneration. All these things are priorities that can't be left for the next spending review, as they always are. It's time to invest now. So, hey, log on to that HM Treasury website. You've got a week. If you don't say anything else, just say give oodles of money to the environment, please.
Brilliant. No, that's a call to action indeed, Richard. Thank you. And it kind of, we are going to struggle to get through all these questions. I'm sorry, guys, because we definitely need to be done by 5 because, you know, people's tummies will be rumbling. But I'm gonna sort of, Stephen, thank you for yours, and Rudy, I'm going to kind of merge those together as one final question. I'm going to throw it back to you, Richard, if I may, because I think you'll probably be the closest to this, but anyone else jump in. So a couple of questions around political agenda, lobbying. Do the structures of government mean that we operate in this kind of short-sighted approach? I'm really interested in the circular economy, for example, and I sometimes struggle to see how that overlays against our existing structures. So I guess I'll throw it to you, Richard, unless anyone else wants to, but have you got any kind of thoughts or reflections on Rudy and Stephen's questions there, being close to government?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely right that the political cycle means that politicians aren't very often held to account for things that are far into the future. And it's not just politicians too. I mean, economists apply a discount rate on investment and spending decisions, because we all tend to discount the future and care more about what's happening now. Things like climate change are starting to open our eyes about the need for intergenerational equity and thinking ahead about our children and not just thinking about ourselves. And there are ways to build that into political thinking. So things like long-term targets, things like extended investment cycles that we've got in some areas are ways to lock in thinking over and above the short-term political cycle. And then I'll end on a sort of note of hope. We often think in terms of doom about climate change and how we're writing away our children's future. Actually, I think it's pretty amazing that as a global community, we're able to say, we are going to start to curtail our consumption now, change the way we live, sometimes avoid doing things we want to do because we're concerned about future generations. And to be able to do that across whatever it is, 196 parties in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is actually an amazing thing and gives me hope for humanity. And I think we can do that more together, and we need to lock it in the law, and we'll beat these problems.
Oh, Richard, that's brilliant. Thank you. That's exactly the kind of optimism you need at this time on a Thursday afternoon, isn't it? Thank you. That's brilliant, guys. I'm going to close out the questions at that point, just conscious of time. But I genuinely, so I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, and I'm grateful that you asked them. And thank you to the panel, you did a cracking job there. Really quickly, Jane, I just wondered if you could fire up for us just the ideas page. So while we've been having our conversations, our audience have been throwing a few ideas at us as well. I think we can probably only see a few of them on the screen, but I can see from checking my app down here that I think we've got about 23, 24 that have come through. So we're not going to talk about them right now, because it's a really broad pot. It's brilliant. But what I will absolutely commit to is we'll make sure that we pull all those together and we'll consolidate. We'll have a think within CIWEM about what we want to do with some of them. And those of you that if you've given details, we can get back to you, but we'll certainly make sure that they're on the website and they're visible as talking points. So genuinely thank you for engaging with us on them, really. I really hope that you've enjoyed this afternoon's discussions. I am so delighted that we've had such engaging debate from our brilliant speakers. I'm really grateful that you gave us your time this afternoon to be part of the conversation, guys. I've absolutely loved it, but then you've probably worked out by now I like a good chat. The next 12 months will undoubtedly be uncertain, and it's going to come with new challenges to our profession and the environment. For CIWEM as a charity, our world has changed significantly, as you can imagine. We want to ensure as much of our work as possible is shared freely, and so if today's reignited your passion for joining us or made you consider taking the next step in your membership journey, do get in touch with the membership team. As I mentioned earlier on, our strong local branch network is a really good way of getting involved with CIWEM. My local town and Humber branch is where my CIWEM journey began. Branches are the heart of our network, so maybe reach out to your local branch and get a bit involved that way as well. And finally, I'd really like to thank you, our audience, for engaging with us this afternoon through Slido and just through being here. We'll obviously take those comments, we'll reflect on them. And the nice thing about this kind of technology is that whilst there were 100+ of you here today, I'm hopeful that we can reach our international members who may be in different time zones, and we'll get their comments too. We all have a role to play within both environmental and social systems, and each of us is critical. These uncertain times provide a unique opportunity, as we've heard, to invest in a green future, make bold policy decisions, and act quickly. I am honoured to be your president for the coming year. I look forward to meeting as many of you as possible and continuing to grow our network of extraordinary members, solving some of the most important challenges that we have. I wish you a lovely evening, afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm going to leave you with my favourite Burkinabe proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.